When I was a child, I was fortunate enough to be allowed to pay a visit to my grandmother. In those days, she lived alone in a rambling old property which had belonged to distant relatives of her late husband. I recall the house boasted an impressive, if somewhat imposing, oak staircase, along which were displayed a number of ornately framed but faded photographs. No single image alluded to any details of topographical or architectural interest. They were, rather, all yellowing portraits of what I took to be distant relatives. In my innocence, I asked my grandmother who all of the people were. Fixing me with a benevolent smile, she informed me, in a gentle and lilting voice, that they were all dead. Some, she explained, had died in the usual manner, in battles, house fires, and so forth, but others had met with more unusual fates. One woman that she pointed out, an aunt as I recall, had been the first in her village to be slain by a household electrical appliance, a vacuum cleaner as it happened. The manufacturers withdrew their all-metal plug design later that same year. Moreover, a stern gentleman of portly disposition, a fond acquaintance, had been shot and killed whilst waiting for an omnibus in that very same village. An unusual occurrence as it transpired. I refer, of course, to the omnibus, not the shooting, for my grandmother then indicated to the likeness of another fellow, a gaunt, melancholic young man and second cousin, who had met with a similar fate. He had been walking off a particularly hefty breakfast of kippers when he had the misfortune to be mistaken for an elk by a local huntsman, and shot quite dead. What made the case worthy of note was the fact that the elk was not a common species in that county, and was, in any case, protected by an ancient statute. Happily, the coroner's verdict of accidental death saved the huntsman from the inconvenience of a small fine. His brother fared little better, when a fiancée left him for a travelling salesman. Grief-stricken, he took to crime and was later executed. Their sister lived for a further 20 years or so, but she eventually succumbed to a bout of septicemia whilst recovering from an operation to remove a bunion. Their parents lived to reach retirement, but were eventually to die in equally fascinating circumstances, when they were swept into the sea at Yarmouth. Another cousin was literally hacked to death by a rampaging madman, who was labouring under the false belief that he was the Duke of Wellington. Ironically, it later transpired that this assailant was also a distant relative, but from another branch of the family. He died tragically when a fellow lunatic throttled him. That incident did at least lead to a fortuitous outcome, when the perpetrator of his sorry demise was afterwards diagnosed as suffering from the delusion that he was in fact Napoleon Bonaparte, and thenceforth successfully cured. My grandmother then pointed to a photograph of my own beloved parents. They had died when trampled mercilessly by stampeding cattle. My two adoring siblings, pictured with them, were also killed in that same tragic incident. I was not present. I had yet to be born when that particular photograph was taken. Interestingly enough, my father's older brother had died shortly after the relief of Khartoum, when, in an attempt to single-handedly repopulate the British Empire, he was bludgeoned to death by several enraged husbands. A studious young man, another brother, had met his end in peacetime, but under no less remarkable circumstances. He had been crushed to death whilst attempting to break the world record for unpowered flight, using only a catapult and some ostrich feathers. Their beloved sister, in the meantime, broke her neck when she fell from a garden swing. Further smiling faces masked equally lurid ends. A pair of young brothers, as a rule inseparable, were simultaneously boiled to death in different locations, one whilst visiting his father's glue factory, and the other his uncle's distillery. Their father, distraught at his own negligence, hung himself, whilst their grief-stricken mother swallowed household bleach in anticipation of a swift demise. She died in agony a few days later. Their uncle prospered in the meantime and became a respected businessman and stalwart of the local community, eventually being voted onto the local municipal council. He died when inspecting the newly refurbished sanitary facilities, which ironically fell out of the scope of his democratic duties. A middle-aged couple, distant relatives of unknown connection, took the pledge and, filled with missionary zeal, emigrated to Papua New Guinea, where, I am sorry to say, they were killed and eaten by headhunters, who had initially worshipped them as gods. Another religious fellow, a respected bishop in his day, and a great uncle, if my memory serves me well, succumbed to a particularly nasty bout of indigestion whilst preaching a sermon on the virtues of abstinence. An unattractive, tubercular woman, another aunt, I believe, succumbed to a coughing fit during the interval whilst visiting the theatre, a pantomime, as I was later told. Yet another aunt, her younger sister, had met her end whilst still a very small child. One of 12 or so children, I was told that she had been inadvertently abandoned whilst on a Sunday school trip to the seaside and pecked to death by seagulls. At this juncture, my grandmother paused, cleared her throat, and pointed to a small photograph of a motor charabanc. The smiling occupants were, it transpired, all close relatives, and had hired the said charabanc for a family outing. Unfortunately, the vehicle had collided with a large bulldozer, one of the first accidents of its kind in this country, and one which resulted in the rather messy annihilation of all on board. Other branches of the family fared little better. A rather plain young woman had tragically died when her brand new Bone Shaker bicycle did exactly that. A proud young fellow had just passed his medical examinations and begun work as a junior doctor in a prestigious royal hospital, when he inadvertently succumbed to a rare bowel disorder. A kindly old lady was blown to smithereens, along with her 2 beloved granddaughters, when her kitchen stove exploded. She had, I later found out, been cooking them a sponge cake as a special treat. An elderly and rather nervous gentleman, her brother, I think, had in the meantime expired from a brain tumour after taking up smoking on doctor's orders. Another distant relative, an uncle of vague connection, had choked to death on his own beard. In the meantime, his daughter, a stern young woman of political persuasion, undertook to tie herself to the railway line at Goring-upon-Thames in protest at the lack of opportunities for female locomotive drivers and engineers. Resisting all attempts at rescue, she was eventually mown down by the 2:27 to Oxford, which had ironically been commandeered by militant suffragettes. Her body was eventually found obstructing the signals at Didcot. Her first cousin fared little better. An attractive child of prodigious talent, he was mysteriously strangled by his pet spaniel, a birthday present from his favourite uncle, who himself died in curious circumstances when he was torn apart by bears whilst touring the Pyrenean mountains as part of a folk music troupe. Oddly enough, his companions later met with a similar fate whilst touring the Carpathians. Stranger still was the tale of another cousin, a happy young woman and talented trampolinist who died whilst visiting the dentist. This unforeseen event was rendered the more noteworthy by the fact that her sister had died only weeks previously when accidentally poisoned by a rhubarb pudding. It transpired that further young women had met with tragic fates. One had died after eloping with her sweetheart, whilst another succumbed to shock after visiting the cinema for the first time and fell into a catatonic stupor from which she never recovered, eventually passing away in a sanatorium. An exceptionally striking young woman has simply faded away whilst composing sonnets to a lost love. Her sister, meanwhile, had drowned whilst bathing her young son, who also tragically expired. Her husband, distraught at this news, had flung himself under a passing tram. It eventually transpired that entire families had been erased from our genealogy. As my grandmother continued, she recounted stories of immense catastrophe and intrigue. One happy little brood had been flattened by a passing steamroller, whilst another had been destroyed whilst picnicking. Stranger still was the tale of a particularly prolific clan, who all succumbed to a severe case of botulism whilst visiting an aunt who eventually made a full recovery, and is, I am relieved to say, still alive and living in Dorset. Most poignant of all, however, was the family who perished when accosted by circus performers. After relating this particularly tragic tale, my grandmother smiled at me and announced that that was that for now. Staring at me through her bifocals, she asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up. I replied that I wanted to be a writer, or failing that, a taxidermist. My grandmother remarked that such ambitions were all very well, if I lived to grow up. Now this last remark troubled me greatly, and I grew fearful that I would not live to reach maturity. I worried that I too would end up as just another faded and yellowing photograph on my grandmother's staircase, and as just another sorry tale of premature death. Thankfully, my grandmother died a few years later, whilst I went on to prosper as a world-famous author and expert in the art of taxidermy. Having settled comfortably into middle age, I began to think about my grandmother's photographs, and happened upon a fancy that I should like to own them, to display them as she had done. I made inquiries amongst my extended family as to their whereabouts, and to my dismay discovered that a distant cousin, upon hearing of my plan, had rather spitefully sold them to a vendor of antiques and curios. Luckily, with the help of a friend, I was able to acquire them. Visiting the aforementioned vendor, my friend distracted him by asking the price of a particularly charming clock, thus enabling me to steal the photographs. I was able to repay the favor a few weeks later, when, repeating the same ruse, I distracted the vendor with a series of inconsequential and importunate proposals, whilst my friend was able to steal the clock. I am happy to say that when my friend died, his family were gracious enough to allow me to keep that very same clock as a memento